Welcome to the InnoGuide Podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. In episode number 21, we share Part 1 of Whiplash, How to Survive Our Faster Future by Joy Ito and Jeff Howe. The Missing Principle. Let me take you on a bit of a journey, one that starts with a man named Duncan Phyfe, a furniture maker in early 19th century America, and ends with a call to rethink how we approach education in the 21st century. Phyfe was one of America's first industrialists, a guy who traded the old artisan system of honor and craftsmanship for something we'd now call a profit margin. Back then, though, people didn't even have the language to describe profit the way we do today. The world was different. Employees drank gin with their morning donuts and often slept under their workbenches. As the novelist L.P. Hartley said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Fyfe's decision to industrialize his furniture-making business, dividing labor and scaling up, seems obvious to us now. Why wouldn't you want to maximize revenue and cut costs? But to his peers, this was a betrayal of the artisan system, where young boys apprenticed with master craftsmen, learned a trade, and eventually became masters themselves. It was a virtuous cycle, deeply tied to the democratic ideals of the time. These artisans saw themselves as the backbone of the American Revolution and the populist movements in Europe. They believed they were riding the wave of progress until they weren't. The factory system Phyfe helped pioneer upended their world. Some artisans adapted, starting their own factories. Others became cogs in the new system or left it entirely. The shift wasn't just economic, it was cultural. The old values of honor and sacrifice gave way to the cold logic of market mechanics. And while this transformation might seem inevitable, in hindsight, it's a reminder that new worlds rarely look the way we expect them to. The story of Phyfe and the artisans didn't make it into the original edition of this book, Whiplash, but we're including it now because it underscores a key point. Change is messy, slow, and full of false starts. It's also exponential. The systems we depend on today, economic, technological, social, are more complex, fragile, and volatile than ever. And the pace of change, it's dizzying. We live in dog years now where weeks feel like hours and years blur by in a haze of screens and information. Take Bitcoin, for example. Back in 2013, Jeff scribbled a note to himself, invest $5,000 in Bitcoin. He didn't, of course, but if he had, that small investment would have turned into $3 million by 2018, before losing 2/3 of its value. Or consider CRISPR, the gene editing technology that was barely on anyone's radar in 2015. By 2018, it was being taught in high schools. These wild swings and breakthroughs are the new normal, and they demand a new way of thinking. Which brings us to education. One of the principles we left out of the original Whiplash was what we now call learning over education. The idea is simple but profound. Education is something done to you. Learning is something you do for yourself. It's not just about adult education or lifelong learning. It's about reimagining the entire system. The current model, designed for the industrial age, was built to churn out factory workers and office drones. It's outdated. In a world where machines are taking over repetitive tasks, we need to teach kids to think, create, and collaborate in ways that machines can't. This isn't a new idea. Maria Montessori was explaining child-centered learning back in 1907. Ivan Illich argued for deschooling society in the 70s, advocating for learning webs instead of rigid institutions. And at the MIT Media Lab, where we've both spent time, Seymour Papert championed constructionism, learning through doing. His ideas inspired tools like the Scratch programming language, which helps kids code to learn rather than learn to code. Neil Gershenfeld's Fab Labs takes this even further, creating spaces where people can learn by making, fostering the kind of creativity and autonomy that Illich dreamed of. Despite decades of reform efforts, our $2 trillion education system has barely changed since Horace Mann's days. Schools still prioritize standardization over individuality, leaving behind kids who don't fit the mold. We measure success by who the system serves, But maybe we should focus on who it doesn't serve and why. As Joseph Aoun wrote in Robot Proof, we need to prepare students for a future where traditional career paths are disappearing. That starts by putting their passions and interests at the center of their learning experience. We feel strongly about this because, frankly, we didn't thrive in traditional schools. Joey dropped out of college twice and was even kicked out of kindergarten for running away too much. Jeff left college just shy of graduating. We weren't bad students. We were just more motivated by our own interests than by what schools tried to impose on us. We've been lucky to build careers around our curiosity and our autodidactic tendencies, but not everyone gets that chance. That's why we believe so deeply in creating a system that empowers every student to learn in their own way. The stakes are high. If we don't adapt, we risk leaving millions of kids behind in a world that's changing faster than ever. But if we embrace new models of learning, ones that prioritize passion, play, and projects, we might just create a future where everyone has the tools to thrive. It's not just about surviving the next wave of change, it's about flourishing in it. And that's a lesson worth learning. Introduction. Let me take you back to December 28, 1895, to a basement in the Grand Café in Paris. A crowd had gathered, paying £1 each to witness something extraordinary. The first living photographs is in quotes. It was an age of spectacle. Paris was alive with seances, magicians, and snake charmers, alongside real scientific marvels like the Eiffel Tower and the first automobiles. The Industrial Revolution had filled life with novelty, and Parisians were primed for anything. But even in this age of wonder, what happened that night was something else entirely. The Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis, had invented the cinematograph, a device that could project moving images. The first film they showed was a simple scene of women leaving a factory. At first, the audience wasn't impressed. After all, you could see women leaving factories all over Paris. Then the image moved. The women streamed out of the factory, skirts swaying, footsteps hurried. The audience gasped, laughed, and applauded. For 50 seconds, they were transfixed. And just like that, the first movie screening in history was over. Word spread quickly. Crowds outside the Grand Café grew so chaotic that police had to intervene. The Lumieres began showing their films across Europe and America, and one of their most famous works, L'arrivée d'un train, the arrival of a train, became legendary. Supposedly, when the audience saw the train barreling across the screen, they panicked, convinced it would burst through and crush them. People scrambled for the exits, piling into the stairwell. Whether or not this actually happened, the story became cinema's founding myth, a way to capture the sheer strangeness of seeing the impossible made real. But here's a twist. By 1900, the Lumiere brothers had walked away from cinema entirely. They declared it an invention without a future and turned their attention to color photography. At the time, this probably seemed like a smart move. Early films were little more than just novelties. Short, plotless scenes like man steps on rake, rake hits man in face. The technology existed, but the medium hadn't been invented yet. It would take years before filmmakers like D.W. Griffith turned moving pictures into what we now recognize as cinema. This isn't just a story about the Lumieres. It's a pattern we see over and over again. Inventors failing to grasp the full potential of their own creations. Samuel Morse, for example, introduced the telegraph in 1844 with the message, "What hath God wrought?" It was a monumental achievement. Information could now travel faster than a horse. But Morse couldn't foresee the telephone, dismissing it as a mere electric toy. Similarly, Thomas Edison thought his phonograph would be used for business dictation, not music. It took someone else to realize its potential and create the recording industry. Even today, we're not immune to this kind of short-sightedness. In 1977, Ken Olsen, the president of Digital Equipment Corporation, famously said, "There's no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home." Decades later, Steve Ballmer of Microsoft dismissed the iPhone, saying it had no chance of gaining market share. These aren't just funny anecdotes. They're reminders that we're all limited by the assumptions of our time. We struggle to see beyond the frameworks we've inherited. This brings us to the central idea of our book. The world is changing faster than we can comprehend. Our technologies have outpaced our ability to understand them, and our old ways of thinking, our habits of mind, are no longer sufficient. Michael Foucault called these underlying systems of thought the episiotomy, while Thomas Kuhn referred to them as paradigms. Whatever you call them, they shape how we interpret the world, often blinding us to new possibilities. For example, early factory managers couldn't see that electric engines could be distributed throughout a factory, rather than clustered in one central location, as the steam engine had been clustered in one location. It took 30 years for them to realize that they could reorganize factories and unlock the full potential of electricity by putting the motors where they were needed, and smaller motors at that. We're in a similar moment now, the digital age driven by Moore's law. Everything gets faster, cheaper, and smaller, and the internet has created a new operating system for the world. But we're still using mental tools from the industrial age. Our assumptions like strength is better than weakness, or risk must always be mitigated, are outdated and even counterproductive. The strong don't always survive anymore, and not all risks need to be avoided. We need new principles to navigate this era of constant exponential change. Think about it. In the past, change was slow. For most of the Earth's history, nothing much happened. Life appeared 4 billion years ago, but it took another 2.8 billion years to discover sex. Fast forward to human history, and even then, progress was glacial. If we condense history into a single year, the Sumerians started smelting bronze in December, and the Industrial Revolution didn't kick off until the morning of December 31st. So that's saying the beginning of the world was January 1. The Sumerians didn't start smelting bronze until December of that year. So all kinds of things happened, but we didn't get into smelting bronze until December. And the Industrial Revolution didn't start until the morning of December 31st. Let's take this model a little further because this is interesting. That morning, train tracks, so the morning of December 31st, in the history of the world being the equivalent of one calendar year. That morning of December 31st, train tracks blossom across the land, and humans finally start moving faster than a horse. The rest of the day is action-packed. Around 2 p.m., infant mortality and life expectancy, both largely unchanged since the exodus from Africa last January, are improved with the introduction of antibiotics. Planes are circling the Earth by late afternoon, and well-heeled companies begin buying mainframe computers around dinner time. It took us 364 days before 1 billion humans walked the Earth. By 7 p.m., there are 3 billion people on the planet, and we just uncorked the first bottle of champagne. That number doubles again before midnight. But the big shift, as an influential 2009 Harvard Business Review article termed it, the big shift occurred around 10 p.m. with the twin revolutions already mentioned, the internet and the integrated circuit chip. Together, the two heralded the beginning of the network age, a more distinct break from the industrial era than anything that has occurred before it. In the space of a few generations, since 10 p.m., to stick to our one-year metaphor, the periods of stability have grown shorter, and disruptive shifts to new paradigms have come with greater frequency. Imminent breakthroughs in fields like genetics, artificial intelligence, manufacturing, transportation, and medicine will only accelerate this dynamic. What if the historical pattern, disruption followed by stabilization, has itself been disrupted? Ask the authors of The Big Shift in another article, The New Reality, Constant Disruption. In essence, change is happening at a breakneck pace. Antibiotics, airplanes, computers, all of these arrive in the blink of an eye, historically speaking. And since the 1970s, with the rise of the internet and microchips, we've entered an era of constant disruption. This isn't just about technology. It's about how we think. The old pattern, disruption followed by stability, itself has been disrupted. We're living in a time of perpetual upheaval, where breakthroughs in genetics, artificial intelligence, and other fields are accelerating faster than we can adapt. High school students are editing genes, and artificial intelligence is reshaping industries. The question isn't whether we're ready for this, it's whether we can even comprehend it. Take virtual reality, for example. The Oculus Rift is already being used for gaming, but its potential goes far beyond that. It could revolutionize medicine, education, even real estate. But the truth is, we have no idea how this technology will evolve. History shows us that the most transformative uses of new inventions often come from the least expected places. Who would have guessed that a teacher of the deaf, Alexander Graham Bell, would invent the telephone, or that a hypnotist and psychic, George Albert Smith, would invent the close-up shot in film? The point is, technology is just a tool. It's what we do with it that matters. Fire can cook your food or burn down your village. Nuclear fission can power cities or destroy them. The internet can connect us or divide us. The future isn't predetermined. It's shaped by how we choose to use the tools at our disposal. So, what's the takeaway? Our book isn't a guide to starting a business or managing a team. It's a set of principles, pro tips, if you will, for navigating the new operating system of the network age. Because principles aren't rigid rules, they're flexible guidelines designed to help you think differently. Because in a world of constant change, the only way to keep up is to change how we think. We're living in extraordinary times. The pace of innovation is staggering and the challenges are immense. But with the right mindset, we can not only survive this era of disruption, we can thrive in it. Let's get started. Asymmetry. Let's talk about how the world has changed and how we need to change with it. Not long ago, the world operated under a kind of Newtonian logic. Big forces countered other big forces. Capital was balanced by labor, governments kept both in check, and large armies defeated smaller ones. Coke worried about Pepsi, that was about it. Yes, there was friction, sometimes bloody, catastrophic friction, but the outcomes followed a predictable order. Everyone understood the rules. Then in just a couple of decades, everything flipped. Suddenly, small forces started having outsized impacts. Think about it. Terrorist organizations with fewer members in a small town have reshaped global politics. A single man, Craig Newmark, upended the entire newspaper industry with Craigslist. And in 2010, an unemployed day trader named Navinder Sai Sarayo used a simple algorithm from his London apartment to trigger a $1 trillion crash in the U.S. securities market. These aren't isolated incidents. They're signs of a new reality. The internet and digital technologies have leveled the playing field, making it possible for small players to disrupt massive systems. This isn't about whether these changes are good or bad. The point is that size no longer guarantees power or stability. In fact, the biggest threats to the status quo often come from the smallest places: startups, rogue actors, indie labs. And while this is happening, the problems we're facing as a society are becoming more complex than ever. Complexity as the new normal. Complexity isn't new. It's been around for billions of years. Nature is full of complex systems: ant colonies, immune responses, the climate, even the biochemistry of a single cell. But humans have a knack for making things even more complicated. Take climate change. We created it, but that doesn't mean we understand it. The economy is another classic example of a complex system. It's made up of countless individual actions, buy, sell, hold, that follow simple rules but create massive, unpredictable ripple effects. It's like an ant colony. No single ant understands the whole system, but together they behave like a superorganism. Complex systems are also adaptive. They change in response to new information, just like the market or ant colonies do. In fact, some complex systems seem designed to process and produce information. Scientists are diving into the study of complexity, and it's one of the most exciting areas of research today. It's interdisciplinary by nature, bringing together the physicists, biologists, and information theorists to tackle problems no single field can solve. According to Scott E. Page, a complexity expert, there are 4 key factors that drive complexity: heterogeneity, networks, interdependency, and adaptation. Imagine these as knobs you can turn up or down. For most of human history, these knobs were set to 0. We lived in isolated, homogeneous communities that did not need to adapt quickly. But now, we've cranked all these knobs to 11, and we have no idea what the consequences will be. Uncertainty, the billion-dollar question. So what happens next? The honest answer, no one knows. Not the consultants at McKinsey, not the analysts at NSA, and definitely not us. Humans have a terrible track record when it comes to predicting the future. In fact, experts often do worse than random guesses. Remember the Wall Street Journal ran a feature where stock pickers competed against darts, and the darts usually won. And now, with the world's complexity dialed up, predicting the future has become even harder. Take global warming, for example. It's not just about rising temperatures. It's about increased volatility. Some regions will get wetter, others drier, and extreme weather events will become more common. The same is true for the economy, technology, and society as a whole. The rules of the game can change overnight. For most of human history, success depended on accurate forecasts. A medieval merchant, for example, could predict that a drought in the Rhineland would drive up wheat prices. But in today's world, unforeseen developments can upend everything in a matter of days. So what do we do? How do we build organizations, governments, or even careers around the principle of not knowing? Embracing the unknown. Not knowing is okay. In fact, admitting ignorance can be a strategic advantage. Instead of wasting resources on futile attempts to predict the future, we can focus on building systems that are flexible, adaptive, and resilient. This is already happening in fields like the military, life sciences, technology, even in journalism. These organizations are hardwired for complexity and unpredictability, and they have more in common than you might think. The MIT Media Lab is a great example of this mindset in action. The lab has always been a place for misfits, artists who create new technologies, engineers who dabble in genetics, computer scientists reinventing education. It's not just interdisciplinary, it's antidisciplinary. People at the lab don't just collaborate across fields, they explore the spaces between and beyond them. This approach started with Nicholas Negroponte, the lab's co-founder. Back in the 1980s, he predicted a future where computers would become both personal devices and disciplines like art and science would converge. The Media Lab embraced this vision, creating a unique funding model where competing companies shared intellectual property to support undirected research. This freedom allowed the lab to pioneer innovations in everything from touchscreens to virtual reality to 3D printing. As the world became more digital, open, and networked, the lab expanded into new fields like social networks, big data, and cryptocurrencies. More recently, it's moved into the hard sciences with projects in biology and neuroscience. For example, Ed Boyden's synthetic neurobiology group is building tools to help brain scientists understand the nervous system, a mission that requires expertise far beyond traditional neurobiology. The Media Lab's success lies in its adaptability. While many organizations have been crushed by change, remember the Palm Pilot? The lab has thrived by sticking to its core principles. These principles, like prioritizing learning over education, are designed to overlap and complement each other. They're not rigid rules. They're flexible guidelines for navigating a complex, fast-changing world. A blueprint for the future. This book is our attempt to share those principles with you. Think of them as pro tips for using the world's new operating system. This isn't a minor update, it's a complete overhaul. The digital age has rewritten the rules and we need to adapt. Our principles aren't about telling you what to think, they're about helping you question the assumptions you didn't even know you had. We're living in extraordinary times, the pace of change is staggering and the challenges are immense. But with the right mindset, we can not only survive this area of disruption, we can thrive in it. These principles are a blueprint for shaping the future, and we hope they will help you navigate the uncertainty ahead. Let's get started with Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Emergence over Authority. For most of human history, we've had this top-down linear way of thinking about knowledge and authority. It started with God or some central figure, and then filtered down through priests, kings, or other leaders to the rest of us. This system, rooted in authority, stuck around for centuries, even as cracks started to show with figures like Martin Luther, who suggested that truth could come from a community rather than a single institution. But now that old model is crumbling and something new is taking its place. Emergence. Emergence is this fascinating idea that big complex systems, whether they're ant colonies, brains, or even human societies, can produce intelligence and innovation without a central authority calling the shots. It's not about replacing authority with chaos or anarchy, but about recognizing that collective action and shared information can lead to outcomes far beyond what any one person or leader could achieve. In the internet, it's been a game changer here, giving billions of people the tools to share ideas, collaborate, and even challenge traditional power structures. Take the Arab Spring, for example. It wasn't led by a single person or group. It was a collective uprising fueled by social media and the internet. Or look at Anonymous, the hacktivist group. They're leaderless, yet they managed to pull off some of the most coordinated and impactful cyber actions in history. Even in politics, movements like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump's campaigns weren't so much led by them as they were surfing the wave of collective energy from their supporters. The idea of emergence isn't just a human thing. It's everywhere in nature. Stephen Johnson, in his book Emergence, compares it to slime mold. Slime mold is this single-celled organism that, when food is scarce, comes together with others to form a superorganism. No one slime mold cell is in charge, but together they create something entirely new. The same thing happens with ideas. When enough people share their thoughts, publish books, or start research centers, those isolated ideas can coalesce into a whole new way of seeing the world. It's like a phase transition when water suddenly turns to ice or vapor. We're living in that moment right now where isolated hunches are melting into collective breakthroughs. And it's not just slime mold. Ant colonies, bird flocks, fish schools, even our own brains, they all work on emergent principles. Your brain, for instance, is made up of billions of neurons, none of which are smart on their own, but together they create consciousness, this incredible ability to think, feel, and even reflect on itself. It's the same with cities, languages, and economies. No one person designs a city's culture or a language's evolution, but they emerge from countless small decisions made by individual people. Even the stock market is an emergent system. Friedrich Hayek, an economist, pointed out that markets aren't just places where buyers and sellers meet. They're these incredible machines for aggregating knowledge. The price of a stock reflects not just on the value of a company, but the collective understanding of the world's stability. And now, with the internet, we've taken that same principle and applied it to information itself. Wikipedia, for example, has replaced the Encyclopedia Britannica as the go-to source for knowledge, not because it's written by experts, but because it's a self-organizing community of contributors. And studies have shown it's just as accurate. But emergence isn't just about information or ideas. It's reshaping science, technology, even how we solve global problems. Take tuberculosis, for instance. It's one of humanity's oldest killers, and while we've made progress with antibiotics, the disease has evolved to resist them. A group of researchers in Europe, calling themselves Team Betancourt, took an emergent approach to fighting it. They used bacteriophages, viruses that attack bacteria, and reprogrammed them to target the genetic mutations that make TB drug resistant. It's like editing the bacteria's DNA to make it vulnerable again. This kind of innovation was not the result of a single genius in a lab. It came from a collaborative, emergent effort involving researchers from 9 countries. And then there's synthetic biology, which is basically the engineering of life itself. It's a field that's exploded thanks to this emergent open source approach. Instead of a few elite scientists working in isolation, you've got students, citizen scientists, and even hobbyists contributing to breakthroughs. One of the pioneers, Tom Knight, started out as a computer scientist but realized that biology could be the next big thing after silicon chips hit their physical limits. He and his collaborators created biobricks, standardized genetic parts that can be combined like Lego pieces to build new biological systems. This democratized biology, making it accessible to anyone with curiosity and a bit of training. The beauty of synthetic biology, and emergence in general, is that it thrives on diversity and collaboration. By lowering the barriers to entry, it's brought in people from all kinds of backgrounds, leading to innovations no one could have predicted. It's like how ant colonies or slime mold work. Each individual contributes a small piece, and together they create something far greater than the sum of their parts. The shift from authority to emergence is happening everywhere. Crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter let creators test their ideas with the public before they even launch. Online education platforms like Khan Academy and community spaces like DIY Bio are empowering people to learn and innovate on their own. And companies are starting to realize that tapping into the collective intelligence of their employees or customers can lead to faster, more creative solutions than traditional top-down decision-making. In the end, emergence isn't just a scientific concept. It's a way of thinking about the world. It challenges the old assumption that there's always a wizard behind the curtain, pulling the strings. Instead, it shows us that complexity, intelligence, and innovation can arise from the bottom up, from the collective actions of individuals. And as we embrace this new paradigm, we're not just changing how we solve problems, we're redefining what it means to create, collaborate, and thrive in the 21st century. P.S. Pushing the pendulum back. Back in 2003, when blogging was still in its early days, I wrote a paper on something I called emergent democracy. It was a hopeful time. My co-authors and I were convinced that the internet, this incredible new tool for connection and communication, was going to revolutionize democracy for the better. We believed it would empower people, foster open dialogue, and create a more participatory and equitable world. Fast forward to 2010, and the Arab Spring seemed to prove us right. People across the Middle East were using social media to organize protests, topple oppressive regimes, and demand change. It felt like the beginning of something truly transformative. But then reality set in. While these tools were great for overthrowing governments, they didn't necessarily help with the next step, building responsible, self-governing democracies. The optimism of Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution quickly gave way to the rise of ISIS and other destabilizing forces. It was a sobering realization. And it wasn't just the Arab Spring. Over time, the internet itself started to shift in ways we hadn't anticipated. The early days of blogging were all about open, self-hosted platforms where people could share ideas freely. But now, much of that has been replaced by the walled gardens of platforms like Facebook and the fleeting, often shallow conversations on Twitter. Worse, the darker side of the internet, the hateful, divisive, and manipulative forces, has become just as organized and effective, if not more so, at using these tools to amplify its voice. What we once saw as a pathway to open discourse and democratic progress has in many ways become a breeding ground for the opposite. It's disheartening to say the least, but for those of us who were so optimistic about the internet's potential a decade ago, this has only strengthened our resolve. We're more determined than ever to create the tools and build the momentum needed to realize the original dream of using technology to advance democracy in a positive, meaningful way. One step we've taken in this direction is the creation of a new research group at the Media Lab called Scalable Cooperation, led by Associate Professor Iyad Rawan. Iyad, who is Syrian, was deeply inspired by both the successes and failures of the emergent democracy movement. He's committed to developing tools that can foster scalable cooperation and help us imagine new forms of democracy. When I interviewed him for the position, his passion and vision really stood out. I'm excited to work with him and others to push the pendulum back in the right direction. I still believe in the internet's potential. I believe we can bend its arc toward justice. It's going to take effort, collaboration, and a renewed commitment to the ideals we started with, but I'm hopeful we can get there. Joy Ito. Chapter 2. Pull over Push. Let's consider a story about two different ways of solving problems, push and pull. For centuries, we relied on push, centralized top-down systems where decisions are made by a few people at the top and resources are distributed according to their plans. It's how governments, corporations, even disaster response teams have traditionally worked. But in today's world, with the internet and modern communications tools, pull, a decentralized, just-in-time approach that draws resources and expertise from networks as needed, is proving to be far more effective. And there's no better example of this than what happened after the 2011 Fukushima disaster. Let's start with the disaster itself. On March 11, 2011, a massive 9.0 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. It was so powerful that it shifted the Earth's axis and moved Japan 8 feet closer to the U.S., but the earthquake was just the beginning. The real catastrophe came when a tsunami, waves twice as high as the seawalls, hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The plant lost power, its cooling systems failed, and within days, 3 of its reactors had melted down, releasing radioactive material into the air and the ocean. It was the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Now here's where the story gets interesting. TEPCO, the company running the plant, and the Japanese government were completely unprepared. They had relied on outdated assumptions and a rigid command and control system. For example, TEPCO had ignored warnings from the geologists about the potential for a massive tsunami, and their emergency response was slow and bureaucratic. Information had to travel up and down layers of management, and the government failed to release critical radiation data to the public. This top-down, push-based approach was a disaster in itself. But while TEPCO and the government floundered, a group of volunteers stepped in and showed the power of pull. Within days after the disaster, a network of concerned citizens, scientists, and hackers came together to form SafeCast, a citizen science initiative to measure and share radiation levels. They didn't wait for orders or resources from a central authority. They pulled what they needed from their networks. They sourced Geiger counters, built their own when supplies ran out, and started collecting data. They even designed a portable Geiger counter called the B-Geigy, letter B, word Geigy, which could be mounted on cars to gather data more efficiently. Safecast didn't just collect the data, they made it public. They created an open platform where anyone could access radiation readings, and by 2016, they had collected over 50 million data points. Their data was more accurate and detailed than the government's, and it empowered people in affected areas to make informed decisions about their safety. Safecast became a global model for how decentralized network efforts can solve problems faster and better than traditional systems. This is the essence of pull. Instead of stockpiling resources or relying on rigid hierarchies, pull strategies taps into networks to bring in the right resources at the right time. It's agile, efficient, and creative. And it's not just about disaster response. It's transforming industries, from hardware development to crowdfunding. Take Kickstarter, for example. It's a pull-based platform that allows creators to raise money directly from the networks. Instead of relying on traditional investors, they can test their idea with the public and get funding from people who believe in their vision. Similarly, platforms like Amazon Web Services let companies rent server space on demand, scaling up or down as needed. This flexibility is the hallmark of pull. It's about using resources only when and where they're needed. Even in gaming, pull strategies are making waves. Blizzard Entertainment, the company behind the World of Warcraft, treats its players as part of its organization. Players contribute ideas, create content, and even become employees. It's hard to tell where the company ends and the community begins. This kind of collaboration is only possible in a pull-based system where networks and relationships drive innovation. But pull isn't just about technology. It's about people. Strong and weak ties in our social networks play a huge role in how we solve problems. Weak ties, those casual connections with acquaintances or friends of friends, are often our greatest source of new ideas and opportunities. Meanwhile, strong ties, our close relationships, help us stay committed and motivated, especially in challenging situations. Safecast is a perfect example of this dynamic. It started with a small group of committed individuals, but it quickly grew into a global network of volunteers, all connected by their shared mission. The beauty of pull is that it empowers people to act on their own passions and ideas. It lowers the barriers to innovation, making it possible for anyone anywhere to contribute. Safecast didn't rely on a central authority. It relied on the creativity and dedication of its network. And that's why it succeeded where traditional systems failed. A shift from push to pull is happening everywhere. It's changing how we think about resources, innovation, and even authority itself. In the past, we relied on centralized systems to organize and allocate resources. But in the networked age, we're learning that the best solutions often come from the edges, not the center. Pull strategies harness the power of networks, enabling serendipitous discoveries and giving people the tools they need to solve problems in real time. So what's the takeaway? The world is moving from push to pull, from rigid hierarchies to flexible networks, from centralized control to decentralized collaboration. And as Safecast shows, this shift isn't just theoretical. It's already changing the way we respond to crises, build communities, and create lasting change. Pull isn't just a strategy, it's a mindset. And in today's world, it's the key to unlocking our collective potential. P.S. Serendipity is not luck. Ever since I was a kid, people have been telling me to focus, they'd say. And sure, I can be hyper-focused when I need to be. But I'm not great at sustained focus. I get excited about everything, and I end up focusing on everything. My peripheral vision, both literally and figuratively, is overdeveloped. I see things on the edges that others might miss, and honestly, I've come to embrace that. When John Seely Brown first introduced me to the concept of the power of pull, it completely changed the way I thought about my own thinking. The world is shifting, and the old way of doing things, stockpiling resources, controlling everything, planning every detail, and pushing orders from the top down, is becoming obsolete. Innovation isn't happening at the center anymore. It's happening at the edges. Instead of relying on stocks of resources, we're moving toward flows, where we pull in what we need when we need it. For me, this means setting a general direction for where I want to go, but also leaving room for serendipity. I let my network provide the resources and connections I need to turn random events into valuable opportunities. This idea ties into sociologist Mark Granovetter's theory of the strength of weak ties. It's often those loose, casual connections, people outside your immediate circle, that bring the most value. They're the ones who introduce you to new ideas, opportunities, or perspectives you wouldn't have encountered otherwise. But let me be clear, serendipity isn't just luck. It's not about sitting back and waiting for good things to happen. It's about creating the right conditions. You need a rich network, full of weak ties, a sharp peripheral vision that's always on, and a genuine enthusiasm for engaging with the world. When you combine these things, you start to notice patterns and opportunities that others might overlook. Think about mushroom hunters. To find mushrooms, they have to be incredibly mindful and present. They can't just look straight ahead. They have to use their peripheral vision to pick up on subtle patterns and movements in the environment. It's the same with serendipity. You have to train yourself to see the opportunities that are hiding in plain sight. Of course, noticing opportunities is only half the battle. The real trick is turning those lucky moments into something meaningful. This requires a balance between two modes. Peripheral vision mode, where you're open and aware, and focus and execution mode, where you zero in and get things done. Switching between these modes is one of the most important skills for making serendipity work for you. Unfortunately, our traditional education system and much of our business training doesn't prepare us for this. We're taught to focus on solving known problems, to execute on specific tasks, and to stick to the plan. But it's this kind of training that limits our ability to imagine, explore, and see the bigger picture. It narrows our vision and makes us less adaptable to change. In a world that's moving from push to pull, we need to think differently. We need to be fully present, curious, and open to exploration. We need a broad portfolio of interests and the ability to respond quickly to opportunities and threats as they arise. If we focus too much on the past or the future, we lose sight of what's happening right now, and that's where the magic of serendipity lives. In many ways, this mindset is like Zen or martial arts training. It requires discipline, dedication, and an open mind. You have to be ready to adapt, to flow with the moment, and to embrace the unexpected. That's how you turn serendipity into something real, something powerful. Joey Ito. Compasses over maps. This next story is about Zach, a boy from the suburbs of New York City who sees the world a little differently. To him, algorithms are like compasses. They help him navigate and understand the hidden patterns that make everything tick. It all started when he realized that the world, from flashlights to video games, run on logic. This moment, when a child discovers that human intent can be turned into logic, is magical. It's either the end of believing in magic or the beginning of discovering it. Zach's dad, David Siegel, noticed this early on. David, a computer scientist and co-founder of the wildly successful quantitative investing firm 2 Sigma, shares his son's fascination with algorithms. While Zach was busy becoming the IT guy for his elementary school, troubleshooting smartboards and programming games in Scratch, David was applying his own algorithmic insights to the chaos of the global financial markets. 2 Sigma, by the way, is no ordinary Wall Street firm. It's more like a tech startup, with hoodie-wearing employees and a culture that thrives on data and innovation. But back to Zach. When he was just 6, he told his dad he wanted to learn how to program. David, thrilled, introduced him to Scratch, a programming platform designed for kids. Scratch is brilliant. It's colorful, fun, lets kids snap together blocks of code like Lego bricks. Zach took to it immediately, creating games like Hangman and connecting with a global community of young coders who shared ideas and collaborated on projects. By 3rd grade, Zach was so into Scratch that he convinced his dad to take him to MIT's Scratch Day, a carnival-like event where kids from all over the world came together to celebrate coding. There, David reconnected with Mitch Resnick, the creator of Scratch and a longtime advocate for using technology to empower kids to create and learn. Mitch's journey is just as fascinating. Inspired by Seymour Papert, the creator of the educational programming language Logo, Mitch has spent decades championing the idea that kids should use computers not just to consume, but to create. Scratch is the culmination of that vision, a tool that makes coding accessible and fun while fostering a sense of community. It's not just about learning to code. It's about using coding as a way to learn how to think, solve problems, and express ideas. The idea of using coding as a learning tool resonated deeply with David. He saw how Scratch could transform education, especially in a world where traditional methods often fail to engage kids. Together, he and Mitch dreamed up something bigger, the Scratch Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to spreading the joy of coding and learning to kids everywhere. But this story isn't just about Zach or Scratch. It's about a broader philosophy. Compasses over maps. Think of it this way. A map gives you a fixed route, but a compass gives you direction and the freedom to explore. In today's fast-changing world, rigid plans often fail. But a strong sense of direction, your compass, can guide you through the uncertainty. This principle is at the heart of innovation, whether it's in education, technology, or even biology. Take the Media Lab at MIT, for example. It thrives on this compass-driven approach, encouraging undirected research that crosses disciplines. One standout project is Neri Oxman's Silk Pavilion, where silkworms and robots work together to create a stunning dome. The project didn't follow a strict plan. Instead, it adapted to the unpredictable behavior of the silkworms, resulting in something truly groundbreaking. The same principle applies to education. Traditional systems like standardized testing and rigid curricula often miss the mark. While programs like KIPP and Common Core have made strides, they're still solving the wrong problem. What kids need isn't just better test scores. They need the tools that teach them how to think critically and creatively. Algebra, for instance, isn't about just solving equations. It's about learning abstract thinking, a skill that acts as a compass for navigating the world. And this brings us back to Scratch. It's not just a coding platform. It's a way to teach kids how to learn, explore, and create. It's about giving them the tools to chart their own paths, guided by their own compasses. Whether it's Zach creating games or a team of undergraduates engineering bacteria to solve real-world problems in the iGEM competition, the goal is the same, to empower people to think differently and innovate. In the end, the story of Zach, David, Mitch, and Scratch is a reminder that the best journeys don't follow a map. They're guided by a compass, fueled by curiosity and open to discovery. And that's how we move forward, whether we're coding, creating, or just trying to make sense of the world around us. P.S. Think mythology, not mission. Back in 2011, Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of the MIT Media Lab, sent me an email with some advice. He said, now and then, I might send you little tips. Things only a parent would tell their child. Feel free to ignore them. And then he shared one of those tips. Never refer to the faculty as, quote, my faculty, unquote. And always say someone works with you, not for you. It was a small but meaningful distinction. And he explained that this mindset was part of the difference between being a corporate leader and being in a role like mine, which he described as more like a civil servant. Now, I agree with Nicholas on most of this, but I'd argue that even in the corporate world, the old-school top-down leadership style of the pre-internet era doesn't work anymore. The world has changed, and so has leadership. When you're leading a complex, creative organization like the Media Lab, you can't rely on rigid plans or detailed maps. The world is too unpredictable, too messy for that. Instead, you need a compass, a sense of direction. But even the word leading might give the wrong impression. It's not about control or power. Leading the Media Lab is more like being a gardener than a CEO. You're watering the plants, tending the compost, trimming the hedges, then stepping back to let the garden grow. The goal is to create an environment where creativity and life can flourish on their own. At the Media Lab, we don't try to control every detail or anticipate every challenge. That's impossible when you're working with hundreds of brilliant, curious, and independent people. Instead, we focus on aligning our compasses, finding a shared direction. It's about being comfortable with not being in control, with not knowing everything that's happening, and still moving forward with confidence and courage. This approach also allows for diversity in thinking, timing, and methods. We don't force everyone to march to the same beat, and that's a good thing. So, if it's not about rules or rigid strategies, what's the secret? It's culture. Culture is everything. It's how we set our compasses, our moral compass, our worldview, our sense of taste and sensibility. And we build that culture through everything we do. The events we host, the emails we send, the meetings we take, the blog posts we write, the rules we make, even the music we play. It's not about a mission statement or a catchy slogan. It's about creating a system of mythologies, stories, and values that guide us and inspire us. In the end, it's not about controlling the garden. It's about nurturing it, setting a direction, letting it grow in its own beautiful, unpredictable way. That's how you lead a creative, innovative organization in today's world. Chapter 4, Risk Over Safety. Let me tell you about Julia Howe. She's a Stanford grad who had this great idea for an iPhone app that could track your sleep patterns using a wristband. It would even act as a virtual sleep coach, giving you tips to improve your rest. Everyone loved the idea, her friends, her family, even venture capitalists. There was one big problem, hardware. Unlike software, which you can launch with a couple of coders, hardware is expensive. Getting a product like her wristband into stores would cost millions, and Julia had less than $1 million in seed money. It seemed like a dead end. Then she met Liam Casey, the CEO of PCH International. Casey didn't offer her money. He offered her something better, access to his supply chain. And this is where things get interesting, because Casey's supply chain is a game changer. He's like a conductor, orchestrating thousands of factories around the world to produce everything from circuit boards to packaging. His database tracks every detail, what factory can make which part, how fast, and at what cost. It's capitalism without capital. You don't need to own a factory, a warehouse, even an office anymore. All you need is an idea and the ability to market it. Casey took Julia's idea and turned it into a product, the Lark wristband, in just 6 months. He even helped her navigate a supply chain crisis after the 2011 Japanese earthquake, finding a replacement part in 2 days. That's the power of agility. The shift in how products are made is huge. It's turning hardware into something more like software, where small players can innovate and compete with the giants. And when the cost of bringing a product to market drops, the rules change. It's no longer about playing it safe. It's about taking risks. The internet has flipped the script. It's now more expensive to protect an idea than to let it loose and see what happens. The new rule is simple: embrace risk. But let's be clear, embracing risk doesn't mean being reckless. It means understanding that the cost of innovation has dropped so much that the nature of risk itself has changed. And take venture capital, for example. Investors used to spend millions on feasibility studies before funding a project. Now they bet on people and ideas, knowing that most will fail, but a few will succeed spectacularly. It's a numbers game, and the low cost of innovation makes it possible. Even big companies like Google and Facebook have embraced this mindset. Google's Larry Page once said that companies decay when they stick to incremental improvements. To stay ahead, you have to take big, bold risks. And it's not just about money, it's about creativity. At the MIT Media Lab, for instance, we took a risk on Neri Oxman's Silk Pavilion, a project that involved thousands of silkworms spinning silk in the lobby of our building. It could have been a disaster, but instead, it became an award-winning example of innovation at the intersection of art and science. The ethos of risk-taking is also what makes places like Shenzhen so extraordinary. Shenzhen isn't just a manufacturing hub in China, it's an entire ecosystem. Factories there can produce anything at scale, from high-end drones to $9 cell phones. And it's not just about the technology, it's about the people. The engineers and factory workers in Shenzhen have a deep understanding of their craft, and they're willing to experiment and take risks. They've even turned piracy into innovation. The so-called Shenzai manufacturers started by making knockoffs, but quickly began improving on the originals, adding features like HD projectors and counterfeit money detectors to their phones. Big companies like Samsung and LG have struggled to keep up. When I visited Shenzhen with a group from the Media Lab, we saw this ecosystem in action. We toured factories that could produce cutting-edge circuit boards, injection-molded parts, even single-unit prototypes by hand. We visited markets where you could buy phone parts by the pound and saw how small shops were building entire phones from recycled components. It was like stepping into a real-life Blade Runner. The creativity and agility of Shenzhen's ecosystem are unmatched, and it's a direct result of their willingness to take risks. This is where the U.S. and other countries need to pay attention. We can't compete with Shenzhen by trying to replicate it. Instead, we need to connect with it and learn from its ethos of experimentation and risk-taking. It might feel like a step backward to a scrappier, more uncertain time in our economic history. But it's essential for survival in today's fast-paced world. Playing it safe is no longer an option. If we want to thrive, we need to embrace risk, celebrate failure, and be willing to start over when things don't work out. That's how we'll stay afloat in an age where innovation moves at lightning speed. P.S. Buy low, sell high. So how do you plan to make money investing? It's simple. Buy low, sell high. But most people don't really understand what that means in practice. So here's a story. I once asked a Japanese government fund manager how he picked his investments. He said, I invest in big companies, the ones without risk. Oh, I have to stop you right there. Everything has risk. The key isn't avoiding risk. It's understanding it. You need to figure out what the risks are, how likely they are to happen, and how they affect the value of the investment. For example, let's say I know Jeff. He's a great entrepreneur. He's working in a field I understand really well. Because I know Jeff, I know the space he's in, I can assess the risks and opportunities better than most people. That means I can afford to pay more for his company's stock than someone who doesn't know Jeff or the industry. To them, it looks riskier than it does to me. Fast forward a few years. Jeff's company is a massive success. It goes public. Suddenly, it's on the front page of the New York Times. Everyone's talking about how amazing it is, and the stock price is skyrocketing. That's when I might decide to sell. Why? Because at that point, people are likely underestimating the risks and overestimating the opportunity. The stock might be overpriced. We have a saying, the information is in the price. Even if the company is in better shape than when I first invested, the market might be overvaluing it. That's when you sell high. The key is to use the information you have to understand the risks, take those risks, and make your move when the time is right. There's always risk. You just have to know how to value it. Now let's talk about the opposite of this strategy, buying high and selling low. This happens all the time. People jump into projects when they're already doing really well, only to stick around until things fall apart. It's the same with students choosing their field of study. If you pick a field that's peaking when you start college, by the time you graduate, the industry might be in decline, and you'll face intense competition for jobs. In Japan, people even joke that the admissions trends at top universities are a trailing indicator of where an industry is headed. So, what's the buy low, sell high approach to education? It's about finding emerging fields, areas where you have a passion and maybe even an unfair advantage. Sure, it's risky, but you're more likely to end up at the top of a growing field with less competition. And even if it doesn't work out, at least you'll be doing something you love. Now let's shift gears a bit. Another important lesson from venture investing is this. When the cost of innovation is low, it's less about minimizing losses and more about amplifying your wins. Here's what I mean. In this chapter, we talked about not spending more on due diligence than the investment itself, and avoiding the trap of throwing good money after bad to save a failing project. But beyond that, you need to focus your energy on nurturing the winners in your portfolio. Think about it. When the cost of starting a company is low, the early rounds of investment are often pretty small. Back in the day when startup costs were high and funding was scarce, investors had all the power. But now, the tables have turned. If you're a serial entrepreneur, with a great product and a strong team, you get to choose your investors. That's especially true in places like Silicon Valley, where the cost of innovation has dropped dramatically. So the takeaway here is simple. Understand risk, embrace it, and focus on the upside. Whether you're investing in stocks, starting a company, or choosing a career path, the principles are the same. Buy low, sell high, and always keep your eye on the opportunities that others might overlook. That's where we'll leave it. Thanks for joining. That's a wrap.